Okay, in this video I'm going to go over how to make a start screen and load in a new level in Unreal 4. So to start off, I've made a simple mock-up of a start screen for a game in Photoshop where I have a background, a logo, and two buttons, start game and options. Now, when I was saving these out, I made sure that I saved them out individually as PNG, so every layer was saved out individually as PNGs. But with the logo and these buttons, I made sure that I cropped around them and saved them out as well, so they weren't taking up the whole screen space. I then imported them into Unreal 4, and when I was in here, I have to just change some of the settings. Just to ensure that the quality is upheld when they're in a widget or a UI. To do that, you select all the textures that you've just brought in and right click them and go to property matrix. Now this property matrix is where you can change properties of multiple assets which are kind of similar at once. So instead of going into all the assets and changing them individually, I can do that here all at once. And what I changed was in level of detail, the LOD group I switched to UI, and under compression I made sure compression settings was at TC editor icon. And that ensured that when this is loaded up a UI, it won't create any bitmaps or it won't blur the image in any way. Next thing what we're going to do is we're going to right click and we're going to go to user interface and we're going to create a widget blueprint, and I'm just going to call this start screen underscore game and open that up. So quite similar to what we did with our health bar and HUD, this is just a blueprint which we can add to our viewport later on, but we're going to make an interaction with the buttons, so when we click on the start game, it is going to load up another level. What we want to do though is we want to make sure that we're doing this in a blank level. You can do this in the level that you're using at the minute, but it's always a good idea to have this blank level which just loads up your start game and then or that user interface, and then when you click on start game it loads in your new level. It's just so that if you're making a game, I suppose, you're not having to wait a long time for your level to load, so then you can click on start game, so that menu pops up straight away. So under maps you want to right click and you want to create a new level, and I'll just call this SS start screen game, and I'll double click on that and I'll just save. So you'll end up with this blank level with nothing in it, which is perfect for what we want. So I'm just going to go back to my HUD and open up my SS underscore game, and the first thing I'm going to do is drag and drop an image into my canvas, and you'll notice in my hierarchy here under my root, under my canvas panel, I'll have my image, and I'm just going to name that background. Under appearance and under the brush tab, I'm just going to select none here, and I'm just going to get my background, and then I'm going to size to content. Okay, so it's just going to ensure that it is the right size. Now I'm using a 1080p image here, so I'm going to just make sure that my resolution is set to 1080, and then I'm going to zero out all these numbers in the top of my details, just so I know it's exactly in place. So that's it for the background. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to load in another image. You'll notice that I can't just drag and drop it in here because these images can't have any children associated to them, like the canvas panel is the parent to my background. So I'm going to have to drag and drop my image onto my canvas panel, and I'm just going to name this here one logo. You'll also notice that this new image is behind my background. That's because the Z order is set to 0, which is exactly the same as my background. What I want to do is I'm going to just change the Z order to 1. You'll see that pops up now. And again, I'm just going to look for my logo and size the content, and then I'll place it over there. One thing about my background as well is if the resolution changes from platform to platform, I want to make sure that my background stays the same size. So I have my anchor up here. If I click one of these pedals and just drag it down to the bottom corner, it just means that if the resolution changes, the image will be rescaled to fit that resolution. And I can also do that for my logo. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to, under my palette, drag in a button. And I'm going to call this start underscore button. And again, I'm going to change the Z order to 1, just so we can see it. And I'm going to place it over here. And you'll notice that under style, what we have is we've got multiple attributes. We've got attributes for normal, hovered, press, and disabled. So we can have a different look for the button depending on if it's in a normal state, if we've hovered our mouse over it, if we've pressed it, or if we've disabled it. So for each one of these, I'm going to have to load in my image, but I'm also going to tint it slightly different. I'm going to make sure I've got size of content on as well. So for the first one, normal, I'm going to go in and I'm going to find my SS start. So I've got my start game here, and I'm going to tint it to be slightly darker, and I'm going to make sure that draw as is set to image. Now under hovered, so this is when we have a mouse over it, I'm still going to get the same image, but I'm going to set the tint to white. So it's going to be a bit darker when it's normal, but then when you hover over it, it's going to brighten up. And then when you've pressed on it, again, just load in my image, draws an image, and I'm going to tint it slightly green. And then for disabled, I'm going to put in that it's slightly darker. So there we have it. So when it's normal, it's kind of going to be slightly dark. When it's hovered over, it's going to brighten up. When we press it, it's going to turn green. And when it's disabled, it's going to be really dark. So those are my states. And again, you could do that for whatever buttons that you want to have in your startup menu. Another thing I want to have happen is that when we press on this, I want it to play an animation where it kind of scales down slightly and then scales back up. We can do that in our animation section. What I first of all have to do though is make sure I've got my start button selected here, and then click on this new animation, and I'll just call this start scale. So with that selected, if I scroll down the details of my button, I can go to this render transform section, and under transform you can see I've got scale, and I can change the size of this button. But as well as that, I've got this little icon which allows me to add a keyframe in to my animation timeline. So initially I do want this set to normal, so 1 by 1 on the X and Y, so I'm just going to keyframe that in. And then I'm going to move it over probably to about 1/4 of a second, something like that. And I'm going to make it 0.8. And I'm going to keyframe that in. And then 1/2 a second, I'm going to make it back to 1. And keyframe that in. So I'll just have this small animation that when it's pressed, it'll kind of scale down and then scale back up. So we want to make sure that we have the coding for that, because if we go to our graph, we've got no coding at all. I'm just going to compile and save this just to ensure everything will appear in my graph. Sometimes your animation doesn't appear in there. See that start scale? Sometimes that doesn't appear unless you compile and save in the designer. I'm just going to select my button again, and I'm going to go down to the bottom. You can see that there's an event here called add on click. So I'm just going to click on that. Brings me to my graph, and it has this event called on clicked, and it's when I click on the start button. And what I wanted to do is I wanted to play animation. And then what I can do is, because I can't find animation in here, it doesn't appear, I can grab my animation from my Blueprint menu over here and just drag it in, get it, and plug it into that animation. So that should work now. The only problem is, even if we play this level, you're going to see that nothing is going to appear, okay, except my character. So what we want to do is we want to go to the level blueprints and open them, and this is where we're going to add in a widget or a node to create that widget to start off with. So I'm going to right click and going to go begin event. So event begin play. What we're going to do is we're going to create a widget, and that class for that widget is going to be our SS game, so our HUD, and the owning player is just going to be player. So player controller, and the return value I'm going to pull out from that viewport. So add the viewport. So if I compile and play that now, we should see our menu pops up, and then when I hover over my start button, you can see it's highlighting. When I press it, you can see it turns green and it plays the animation, but it's not loading in our game. So what we want to do is just go back to our widget and into the graph, and we want to add in a delay before we load our level because we want to see that animation. Now I know the animation lasts half a second, so I'm just going to make sure that I have a delay here of about 0.7 seconds. So we just see that animation and it loads in the level. So after that delay is completed, we'll type in level and we'll get open level. And then what we want to do is type in viewport, and we want to remove this from the viewport. So it's going to play the animation, it's going to delay for 0.7 seconds, and then it's going to open our level and then remove that HUD from the viewport. So we need to get our level name, and my level name is example_map, and you have to make sure that you've got this exactly the same. So if it has a capital E or capital M, I've got to make sure I've got that in there. So level name is example_map, and I'll compile and save that and press play. So now if I click on start, it'll play right into my level. So that's how you set up a simple start screen in Unreal 4. We'll go further later on and we'll add in more options that maybe we can change the resolution. We'll add in maybe high scores, that type of thing as well.